Fish 11. Free will versus determinism. Introductory premise. Just as the autonomous beating of one's heart is governed by one's genes, such as the presence of a congenital heart condition, as well as the present life conditioning of the heart, such as myocardial infarction, as a consequence of the consumption of excessive fats and oils, or heart palpitations, due to severe emotional distress, each and every one of our thoughts and actions is governed by our genetic sequence, as well as our diverse environmental milieu. This lesson is possibly the most difficult concept for we humans to accept, because we refuse to believe that we are not the ultimate creators of our own thoughts and actions, since free will seems to be so palpably obvious on the prima facie level. From the appearance of the pseudo-ego, i.e. one's inaccurate conception of oneself, see Chapter 10, at the age of approximately 2.5, we have been constantly conditioned by our parents, teachers, and society, to believe that we are solely responsible for our thoughts and deeds. This deeply ingrained belief is excruciatingly difficult to abandon, which is probably the main reason why there are very few humans extant who are spiritually enlightened, or at least, who are liberated from the 5 manifestations of mental suffering explained elsewhere in A Final Instruction Sheet for Humanity, since suffering, as opposed to mere pain, is predicated solely upon the erroneous belief in free will. Standard definitions. Free will is usually defined as the ability for a person to make a conscious decision to do otherwise, that is to say, choose to have performed an action other than what one has already completed, if one had been given the opportunity to do so. In order to make it perfectly clear, if, for example, one is handed a restaurant menu with several dishes listed, one could decide that one dish is equally as desirable as the next dish, and choose either option. If humans truly possessed freedom of will, then logically speaking, a person who adores cats and detests dogs ought to be able to suddenly switch their preferences at any given point in time, or to be hair-splitting, even voluntarily pause the beating of his or her own heart. Of course, those who believe in free will find this last assertion to be preposterous, countering thus, clearly, we are not claiming that humans have absolute freedom of volition, but merely that, in many circumstances, when given the opportunity, we can make choices between 2 or more options. However, even this statement is rather misleading, and can easily be dismissed by those in the know. So, in both of the above examples, there is a pre-existing preference for one particular dish or pet. Even if one liked cats and dogs equally, and one was literally forced to choose one over the other, that choice would not be truly independent, but based entirely upon one's genetic sequence, plus one's up-to-date conditioning. Actual equality is non-existent in the macro-phenomenal sphere. If one was to somehow return to the time when any particular decision was made, the exact same decision would again be made, as all the circumstances would be identical. Freedom of choice. The most common argument against fatalism, or determinism, is that humans, unlike other animals, have the ability to choose what they can do, think, or feel. First of all, many species of higher mammals also make choices. For instance, a cat can see 2 birds and choose which of the 2 birds to prey upon, or choose whether or not to play with a ball that is thrown its way, depending on its conditioning, e.g., its mood. That choices are made is indisputable, but those choices are dependent entirely upon one's genes and one's conditioning. There is no third factor involved on the phenomenal plane. On the noumenal level, thoughts and deeds are in accordance with the preordained story of life. Read previous chapters of this book, in order to understand that existence is essentially monistic. Chapter 08, specifically, explains how actions performed in the present are the result of chains of causation, all the way back to the earliest known event in our universe, the so-called Big Bang, singularity. Thus, in practice, it could be said that the notions of determinism and causation are synonymous concepts. At this point, it should be noted that according to reputable geneticists, it is possible for genes to mutate during the lifetime of any particular person. However, that phenomenon would be included under the conditioning aspect, since the genes mutate according to whatever conditioning is imposed upon the human organism. It is simply impossible for a person to use sheer force of will to change their own genetic code. Essentially, conditioning includes everything that acts upon a person from conception unto death, and over which there is no control. At the risk of being repetitive, it must be emphasized that a person, whether it be a human person or a non-human person, making a choice of any kind, is not to be equated with freedom of volition, because those choices were themselves determined by the genetic sequence and the unique up-to-date conditioning of the person in question, as will be fully explicated below. Unfortunately, no matter how many times this fact is asserted and explained, many free will proponents seemingly become deaf. If you, the reader, upon reaching the end of this chapter, still believe in free will, it is suggested that you read it several times, and dwell on its points over a length of time, especially this paragraph. Academic studies. University studies in recent years have demonstrated, by the use of hypnosis and complex experimentation, that conscious volition is either unnecessary for a decision to be enacted upon or, in the case of hypnotic testing, that free will choices are completely superfluous to actions. Because scientific research into free will is a recent field of inquiry, it is recommended that the reader search online for the latest findings. I contend, however, that indeterminacy is a purely philosophical conundrum. I am highly skeptical in relation to freedom of volition being either demonstrated or disproven by neuroscience, because even if free will was proven by cognitive science, it would not take into account the ultimate cause of that free will existing in the first place. The origin of this claimed freedom of volition would need to be precisely established. Randomness is impossible. If any particular volitional act was not caused by the sum of all antecedent states of being, then the only alternative explanation would be due to true randomness. Many quantum physicists construe that subatomic particles can arbitrarily move in space, but true stochasticity is problematic in any possible universe, what to speak of in a closed, deterministic universe. Just as the typical person believes that the collision of two motor vehicles was the result of pure chance, hence the term accident, physicists are unable to see that the seeming unpredictability of quantum events are, in fact, determined by a force hitherto undiscovered by the material sciences. It is a known fact of logic that a random number generator cannot exist, since no computational machine or software program is able to make the decision to generate a number capriciously. Any number generated will be a consequence of human programming, which in turn is the result of genetic programming, etc. True randomness implies that there were no determinants whatever in the making of a conscious decision or in the execution of an act of will. Some skeptics, that is, disbelievers in determinism, have cited Heisenberg's uncertainty principle as conclusive proof that free will exists. However, most, if not all, such skeptics are simply displaying their own abject ignorance of quantum mechanics, because the uncertainty principle has naught to do with the determined random dichotomy, but merely states that there is a limit to the precision with which certain pairs of physical properties, such as position and momentum, can be simultaneously known. In other words, the more accurately one property is measured, the less accurately the other property can be known. Even if quantum physicists eventually prove beyond any doubt whatsoever that quantum indeterminacy is factual, for which they will be required to explain the origin of such stochasticity, which seems inconceivable, it will not demonstrate that human choices and decisions will be random, or free, to use a more vague term. That would be akin to stating, one of the electrons in my left foot suddenly decided to spin clockwise, and sir, I resolved to skip breakfast this morning. How ludicrous. Congenital determinism. Neither did we choose which deoxyribonucleic acid our biological parents bequeathed to us, nor most all the conditions to which we were exposed throughout our lives, yet we somehow believe that we are fully autonomous beings, with the ability to think, feel, and behave as we desire. The truth is, we cannot know for certain what even our next thought will be. Do we decide to choose our thoughts and deeds? Not likely. For example, if I was to say to myself, my next thought will be, how amazing is it that there exists a huge number of carnists who attack veganism, despite the fact that humans are a herbivorous species of animal, and the fact that those carnists are harming themselves, as well as the poor, defenseless animals whose lives they wantonly destroy. There is the distinct possibility that I will have a rather divergent thought, since there is a plethora of events that could interrupt my thought processes. If, for instance, my telephone rings, my thoughts will turn there. Does an infant choose to learn how to walk or to begin speaking, or does it just happen automatically, according to its nature? Obviously, the toddler begins to walk, and to speak, according to its genes. Some children are far more intelligent and verbose, and more agile than others, depending on the genetic expression, and according to all the conditions to which he or she has been exposed so far. Some parents begin speaking to their kids even while they are in the womb, or expose their offspring to highly intellectual dialogues whilst still in the cradle. Here, it should be quite obvious that there is no real freedom of volition being enacted by the infant, even if the toddler thinks, "How I want to walk around on 2 legs, just like Mama." Because such a thought was a natural correlate of human development, due to our evolutionary history. A practical thought experiment. Those who believe in free will ought to be challenged with the following experiment. At 5 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, for 1 hour, think of nothing but blue butterflies. If anyone can pass such a test, then they must be 1 in a billion, and even so, that does not substantiate free will, but merely evidence that they have learnt to focus their mind on a level far beyond the average person, due solely to their genes and their conditioning. When an extraneous thought appears within that hour, as will inevitably occur, from where does that thought arise? Think about it. If we are truly the authors of our own mentation, then from where does our initial thought or our first dream arise whilst we are still in the womb? If we did not consciously generate our very first thought, why do we assume that any of our preceding thoughts are freely produced? Even those decisions, choices that we seem to make, are entirely predicated upon our genes and our conditioning, and cannot be free, in any sense of the word. To claim that one is the ultimate creator of one's thoughts and actions, is tantamount to believing that one created one's very being. If a computer program or artificially intelligent robot considered itself to be the cause of its activity, it would seem absurd to the average person. Yet, that is precisely what virtually every human who has ever lived, mistakenly believes of his, her own thoughts and deeds. The illusion of freedom. The impression that we have free will can be considered a gift of life, or God's grace. Otherwise, we may be resentful of our lack of free will, since, unlike other creatures, we humans have the intelligence to comprehend our own existence. Even an enlightened sage, who has fully realized that he is not the true author of his thoughts and actions, is not conscious of his lack of volition at every moment of the day. At best, he may recall his lack of freedom during those times when suffering, as opposed to mere pain, begins to enter the mind or the intellect. Many, if not most, scientists, particularly academic philosophers and physicists, accept determinism or fatalism to be the most logical alternative to indeterminacy, but it seems, at least anecdotally, that they rarely, if ever, live their lives conscious of the fact that the daily actions are fated. Chains of causation. When a person blames another person for his or her actions, whether good or bad, or, in order to be more accurate, whether they are moral or immoral, it is akin to attributing malice to the penultimate domino in a row of dominoes, for doing what it did to fell the final domino, when in actual fact, the ultimate cause of the final domino falling was the initial domino that fell. If anyone is to blame for anything at all, surely it is the entity that created everything. Who then is that supreme creator? That thou art, tat tvam asi, in Sanskrit. Read chapter 08, for a succinct, yet accurate, explanation for this chain of causation, and chapter 05, in order to understand the primal self. Briefly, however, there is nothing and no one to blame for anything that occurs in this world, for we are all the one. Cf. Evil, the problem of, in the glossary. Therefore, every action, including seemingly heinous deeds, is ultimately in alignment with the predestined story of life, or, for those who are attached to a theistic viewpoint, God's perfect will, since nothing could have transpired differently, given the circumstances. This does not imply that a person ought to deliberately perform criminal acts, and afterward, use his lack of free will to justify his actions. If, however, he does, in fact, blame his dastardly deeds on a lack of personal freedom, that blame too was destined, just as any consequences were destined. Unfortunately, very few crimes are now punished in so-called first world societies, which helps to explain why the westernized nations are morally bankrupt. When did you last hear of an adulterous couple being sentenced to death for their sin, for example? Never, I would propose. Punishment for predetermined actions. In recent times, in many, if not most, jurisdictions, courts of law have given leeway to those convicted criminals whose crimes were shown to have been committed whilst the person in question was temporarily or permanently insane. The judge or the jury has determined that those perpetrators were not altogether responsible for their actions, due to their mental state at the time, and have sentenced them accordingly. Of course, according to the postulations in this teaching, every action, whether criminal or not, is enacted without true freedom of volition. So then, how should any particular criminal be punished for her unwilling crime? That question is adequately answered in the following chapter, but suffice to say, each case ought to be judged on an individual basis. In the case of a person who has been competently diagnosed with an obvious neurological disorder, he or she may be incarcerated in a mental hospital, whilst a person who seems to have sufficient control over his or her actions may be required to be imprisoned in a regular jail, or some other form of penitence, depending on the severity of the crime. In order to make it perfectly clear, many or most human actions are willed, though this will is totally and utterly predetermined. Non-human animal crimes. According to my informal, personal research, very few humans seem to believe that non-human animals have free will, presumably because they consider freedom of volition to be a very high-order cognitive process that humanoid creatures alone possess. However, if a dog was to maul a baby to death, most everyone would undoubtedly agree that the dog ought to be put to death, or at least that it should be quarantined in a location where it will no longer have access to vulnerable children. Therefore, to put it succinctly, in the ultimate, metaphysical sense, the dog is not morally responsible for its action, yet it must be penalized in some manner, in order to protect society from any danger. Likewise, humans, despite our lack of free will, ought to be punished for our crimes, for purely pragmatic reasons. The alternative is societal destruction. In both this chapter and the next chapter, there are passages which imply that animals, particularly some species of higher mammals, such as dogs, cats, cetaceans and apes, make conscious choices and decisions, which is what the overwhelming majority of philosophers consider to be consistent with freedom of volition, and may possess moral culpability, in the same fashion as do we Homo sapiens. Well, to be perfectly blunt, I am hereby asserting, with the abundance of evidence already provided in the aforementioned chapters, that some animals can and do make choices in precisely the same manner as do we humans, and can be, nay, should be, held accountable for their actions, at least insofar as their actions relate to we humans. So, when a non-human animal, such as a dog or a cat, harms another animal, such as another dog or cat, we ought to see that action as part of their nature, and not necessarily interfere with that natural course of affairs, unless one or both animals was a family pet. However, if the same animal causes harm to a human, such as the example already given in the previous paragraph, where a dog may attack a human baby, it must be castigated in an appropriate manner, again, as already mentioned above. So, to make it abundantly clear, just as we humans do not boast any degree of free will, yet must be held accountable for our harmful, i.e. immoral, deeds, so too should any other living creature be held accountable for its actions, at least, in relation to a human person, despite their lack of freedom of volition, and punished in a suitable fashion, such as being constrained in a cage, disciplined, if a domestic pet, or even being put to death, if necessary. Non-human animals, at least most mammals, have the ability to make conscious choices, based on their genes and their conditioning. If this was not the case, then, for example, every cat that has ever lived, and will ever live, upon seeing a pigeon on the ground before it, will behave in precisely the same manner, as if by force of nature. This choice does not prove that cats possess freedom of volition, but merely that each individual feline will behave according to its unique, inherent nature, which, as repeatedly stated previously, is predicated solely on its peculiar genotype and its idiosyncratic conditioning up to that point in time. Even very simple animals, such as insects, respond to the same stimulus in slightly different ways, depending on various factors, that is, various conditions. For example, in the case of a human entering a room infested with cockroaches, not every roach will flee in the same direction and at the same speed. The insects will scurry, and possibly even spread their wings and fly, in multifarious directions and at various speeds, depending on circumstances beyond their control, such as their proximity to another insect, their physical fitness, and the location of their nest, or a nearby form of shelter, such as a piece of low-lying furniture. So too, we humans are merely biophysical machines, organic robots, designed and programmed to behave in a totally predictable and determined fashion, according to the genetic sequence we inherited from our parents, as well as the extrinsic conditions to which we have been exposed. A case study. Very few persons would argue that we humans have control over the genetic sequence with which we were bequeathed by our parents. Yet, most humans would claim that we are constantly controlling the conditions to which we are being exposed. A typical counterfactual argument made by proponents of free will, to the assertion that we humans have no genuine control over our conditionings, may read as follows. You say that, apart from our genetic sequence, everything is determined by our conditioning, and that we have no meaningful control over that conditioning. Surely, though, when I make a decision or choice, that resolution is independent of any conditions surrounding my choice. For instance, if I was to choose to consume an apple instead of an orange, that decision and that action is fully under my control, is it not? The following 3 paragraphs, however, if carefully studied, should clearly demonstrate that, in all actuality, there is no factual, independent control over human volition. As will be shown, our choices are fully determined by our genetic sequence and unique lifelong conditioning. Imagine a scenario where a choice is to be made between 2 alternatives that seem to be equally desirable. For instance, you are equally fond of both apples and oranges and you decide to consume the apple instead of the orange. The first problem is the fact that you cannot, in all actuality, be equally fond of both kinds of fruit, because, as previously mentioned in more than a couple of places in a final instruction sheet for humanity, true equality is non-existent in the phenomenal sphere. Equality exists solely in the conceptual realm. Even if you believe that you enjoy both fruits 90% compared with your favorite fruit, let's say, persimmon, which you like 100%, in actual fact, the most accurate measurement may be that you like apples 90.5% and oranges 88.48%. However, for all intents and purposes, let us suppose that you are, genetically, equally disposed to consuming either kind of fruit. After all, you don't always eat apples, do you? You often eat oranges as well. So, then, what inspired you to choose one fruit over the other? That would be the various conditionings present before and at the time of your decision. For example, let us say you chose to eat the apple today. The reason you chose that particular kind of fruit over the orange could have been due to a whole variety of factors that were not under your control. You could have chosen the apple because the previous fruit you consumed was an orange, because you were experiencing loose bowel movements and suspected that the citrus fruit would exacerbate your condition, because the orange was in poor condition, because you were about to visit someone who was quite fond of oranges and wanted to gift the orange to him, or simply because the apple was closer at hand than the other fruit. Tomorrow, if you are required to make the same choice, the conditions surrounding your decision will necessarily be different, and you may choose to eat the orange instead of the apple. An even less obvious choice than apple versus orange would be between a large, slightly bruised apple and a small apple in excellent condition. In my particular case, I would invariably choose a very large apple with a couple of ugly bruises, and then discard the unpalatable portions, over a small apple in pristine condition, whereas another person may make the opposite choice, if he or she is averse to consuming bruised fruits. Such preferences cannot easily be changed, because they are entirely the consequences of one's unique genetic sequence and conditionings. In order for such inclinations to transmogrify, it is necessary for one's circumstances and conditionings to transmute, over a period of time. Thus, if the choice to eat one kind of fruit over a, supposedly, equally desirable kind of fruit, is not governed by anything under your control, how more so any other array of choices, such as whom to marry, which tourist attraction to visit for your annual vacation, what occupation to pursue, which clothes to wear each day, which movie to watch next, or which brand of refrigerator to purchase. Even the fact that I chose to type the word refrigerator instead of any other item was determined by the fact that, whilst looking around my residence for an article to mention in the previous sentence, I spotted my refrigerator. This reveals an instance of the conditioning aspect of decision making. If I had seen my camera, I may have chosen to type camera instead, but I was conditioned by circumstances outside of my control to do otherwise. So, it is not so much that I could not have chosen to type camera, but that I would not have done so, given the particular state of affairs. Random thoughts. Everything is permissible, but not everything is beneficial. One can eat junk food, yet that is not going to benefit one's physiology in any way, unless, of course, it enables one to temporarily survive a famine. We can murder our enemy, but we may not escape being punished by the local judicial system. Therefore, lack of free will is not to be used as an excuse for immoral behavior, or for negligence of one's societal duties. This explains the reason why this wisdom teaching was traditionally reserved for students of a high caliber. It requires an unusually wise and intelligent person to understand that, despite everything being preordained, to blame one's lack of free will for criminal actions, and expecting to not be punished for them, is unproductive to a peaceful society. Even today, with easy access to knowledge and information, few persons will come to hear this teaching, and fewer still will realize it, and then integrate it into the daily lives. That, too, is a consequence of destiny. As adequately explained in chapters 15 and 17 of this holiest book of all, in actual fact, almost inarguably, the only factually sacred work of literature extant, the understanding that every aspect of our lives is determined, is not only beneficial to human psychology, it is practically mandatory for the achievement of genuine peace and true happiness. When one is fully convinced, by logic, reason, and evidence, that no living creature has independent freedom of volition, one automatically abandons any conception of blame, praise, pride, anxiety, and worry, and one lives one's life in the present moment, giving little to no thought to traumatic past events, nor to possible future outcomes. After all, how could an enlightened man hold anything more than an impulsive attitude of blame, for being abused by a parent 3 decades in the past, if he knows for certain that his mother or father could not have done otherwise, given his parents' genes and social conditioning? When my first ex-wife apologized to me for destroying my family, a couple of decades after the event, my initial thought was, she could not have desisted from abandoning me, stealing my children, and prostituting herself to strange men, for that was her nature at the time. Tessie recently experienced some kind of religious conversion, hence her apology. Knowing that she would be disagreeable to making amends for her wickedness, my response to her was, you can make up for it by becoming a kind-hearted vegan. Sadly, she declined my modest request. The miracle of free will. For one to assume that free will suddenly and inexplicably appeared on this planet at the birth of the first Homo sapiens, is the height of presumption. This assumption alone is sufficient cause for the notion of indeterminacy to be critically questioned, what to speak of the wealth of evidence provided in the preceding paragraphs. Even if one cannot accept the notion of determinism to be true, one should at least grant the obvious fact that our alleged freedom to act as we will is extremely limited. Try to stop breathing for more than a few minutes and see what happens. Perhaps the most amazing thing about this topic is the fact that it is possible for a human being to come to realize, as opposed to simply intellectualize, that his or her thoughts, words, and deeds were totally and utterly determined from the very start of the universe. Right-pointing arrow. One day, possibly in the far distant future, humanity, as a whole, will come to see the obvious truth of its lack of freedom of volition. Free will is an illusion. Our wills are simply not of our own making. Thoughts and intentions emerge from background causes of which we are unaware and over which we exert no conscious control. We do not have the freedom we think we have. You cannot choose what you are going to think next, because that would require you to think it before you think it. From Free Will. Samuel Benjamin, Sam Harris. American neuroscientist and philosopher. We ought to regard the present state of the universe as the effect of its antecedent state, and as the cause of the state that is to follow. An intelligence, knowing all the forces acting in nature at a given instant, as well as the momentary positions of all things in the universe, would be able to comprehend, in one single formula, the motions of the largest bodies, as well as the lightest atoms in the world, provided that its intellect was sufficiently powerful to subject all data to analysis. To it, nothing would be uncertain. The future, as well as the past, would be present to its eyes. The perfection the human mind has been able to give to astronomy affords but a feeble outline of such an intelligence. Pierre-Simon de Laplace. French polymath. To be, or not to be, that is the question. All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. William Shakespeare. English playwright. We should rather consider the events, as they happen, with the same eye as we consider the printed word that we read, knowing full well that it was there before we read it. You can do what you will, but in any given moment you can will only one definite thing, and absolutely nothing other than that one thing. From Essay on the Freedom of the Will. Arthur Schopenhauer. German philosopher. The Lord dwelleth in the hearts of all beings, causing all to behave as if seated on a machine, under his illusory spell. Lord Sri Krishna, or, to be more accurate, whoever composed the particular verse of Mahabharata. Bhagavad Gita, 1861, from Mahabharata, 640, 61. Krishnadvipayana, Srila Vyasadeva. Translation by Jagadguru Swami Vivekananda. The current world teacher, that is, the Lord, God and Master of this particular planet. Addendum. A dialectic exploration of determinism versus freedom of will. TWT, the world teacher, I am supremely confident that there is no such thing as freedom of volition, for any living creature in our universe. You, my interlocutor, that is ridiculous. Of course we have free will. I make conscious decisions all day long. TWT, obviously, we do make decisions and choose between two or more options, but if you would study this matter in depth, as I have done, you will realize that those decisions were entirely dependent on a whole range of factors, and that none of those factors were directly under your control. But if I decide, out of my freedom of volition, to now raise my right arm, I have full control over that action, so how can you possibly claim that I have no control over my actions? TWT, that is a good riposte, but it is imperative to understand what I mean by the phrase, direct control. Of course, when you decide to raise your arm, it certainly appears that you are controlling your limb. However, if you would come to realize, again, by studying this subject in a scientifically rigorous manner, that the only reason why you seem to be in control of that action is fully dependent on a host of factors that either you had absolutely no direct control over, or else you had very little control over, you would see my point. Factually, even those actions that you seem to be controlling on a purely physical level were destined to occur, given all the relevant circumstances, and for that reason, I use the phrase, seem to be controlling, or directly under your control. Ultimately, every action we perform, despite seeming to be under our physical control, was instigated by the first known action or motion in our universe. That may be true of non-human animals, but can you not see that we Homo sapiens are differentiated from those animals? TWT, again, this is something you need to spend much time studying, but in brief, let me ask you this: do you believe any of our human ancestors, such as Neanderthals, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, etc., possessed freedom of volition? Wow, I never even thought of that. That is a good point, because if only we humans have free will, then it must have started Somewhere in the evolution of our species, right? Honestly, I don't know how to answer that question. Tell me more. TWT, exactly. If anybody claims that only we humans have free will, and that certainly seems to be the majority opinion of humans, they will need to explain precisely at what stage in human evolution that supposed free will began, and what precisely is free will, because as I alluded to previously, one cannot assert that a choice between two or more options constitutes freedom of volition. In that case, how would you define free will, Jagadguru? TWT. The notion of freedom implies stochasticity, meaning that there are no influences at play. Simply stated, it refers to a random act. I apologize for skipping back to the previous point, Master, but I just realized something. If it is difficult, if not impossible, to determine at what point in human history that free will began, it would be an equally difficult conundrum to figure out at what point of our individual growth we are endowed with freedom of volition. TWT. Yes. I should have mentioned that point myself, because there is no doubt whatever that a zygote cannot make decisions and choices. So, then, we would need to work out exactly when free will starts in our childhood. TWT. Assuming that free will exists, of course. Indeed. I am beginning to see that your insights on the subject are very incisive, and I am planning to heed your wise advice for me to investigate the concept of determinism. Assuming that free will doesn't exist, why would I endeavor to accomplish any of my desires? I may as well just stay in bed all day. TWT. If you did, in fact, alter your behavior after realizing that determinism is true, that too was fully determined from all eternity, so you cannot say that you are changing your destiny. Every single motion, thought, or deed, from the very beginning of this universe, in the most minute details imaginable, was destined to occur in precisely the manner in which it did occur, including quantum events. But if there is no free will, we cannot be held responsible for our moral wrongdoings, would you agree? TWT. Ultimately, that may be correct, but in practice, it is important to hold others accountable for their misdeeds, or else society will crumble. Furthermore, very few persons will come to accept the accuracy of determinism, so in general, we humans will continue to behave in the same manner that we always have, and punish criminals for their crimes. So, in other words, just as crimes are inevitable, so too is the retribution that the criminals will attract. Humans will always intuit that harmful acts are unwelcome, and will attempt to redress such harms. There is absolutely no way to circumvent this, and this is just as well, for who wants to reside in a lawless society? Okay then, I will look into the notion of determinism more fully, and let you know what I discover. TWT. Great. I look forward to finding out what you have learnt on the subject. Keep in mind that it may take many weeks, months, years, or even decades, for the fact of determinism to be properly realized, and if you never come to realize this concept, it too was determined. Awesome, Swami. TWT. Thanks for the chat, slave.